Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Reinsurance Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jared Lee.
And I'm Ben Rose.
Welcome
Another
back.
co-host. I have no title.
I'm Ben, just like me.
And I'm also here.
And shouting from the distance is Ben.
Indeed. What are we talking about?
This
we're doing part two.
is part two.
Part two.
You can see how organized we are at times.
Yeah, we should.
Why are we here? What day is it?
What was part one?
Part one is all about the reinsurance placement process, by which we horribly misjudged and ran out of time halfway through.
And we figured out, I think, that by the end of the combination of pre-placement and placement, everybody had sort of been manually collecting together a ton of information in spreadsheets, in an unimaginable number of spreadsheets.
Yeah.
And now we're on to post-placement for part two to talk about the sort of pile of nonsense that's left over that needs sorting out.
In the first part, you raised an interesting sort of point around how everyone's sort of putting this data into their system. And it's a really interesting thing that happens because there's the truth, right, where it's like, this is the client, like it's on the contract, that's the client. This is the broker placing the deal. And these are all the underwriters on that deal with like their legal entity names. But when then every single party goes out and re-enters it into their own systems, all of a sudden things stop matching really nicely, right? Systems don't agree that they might categorize Aon as one company or Aon London as a different entity than Aon Singapore, or, you know, all of these various little things begin to happen. And when you multiply the data entry times dozens and dozens of firms, very quickly you end this world where it's like, they're all on the same contract, but you begin to get some real discrepancies as to what should or shouldn't be happening. And this is now important because now we're talking about money. Now someone needs to ask someone for money, and someone needs to they need to pay someone that. And then when claims happen, you need to go to those correct parties and ask for the claim to be repaid to you. And so getting that data is right, super, super important.
And some of this is, I hate to say it, but kind of reinsurance's fault for being so beautiful and brilliant that effectively it's impossible to codify to the fullest imaginable extent. And so you do always end up with having to make a choice, right? Yep. Because we're talking about bespoke contracts, we're talking about a lot of freedom when it comes, obviously with customs and things that you're used to seeing. You wouldn't want to have to go to market with something that an underwriter's never seen before every year. But, you know, you could have any number of layers and sections and coverages and so on. I combined together in all sorts of ways, combined in a vertical way, a horizontal way, reinstatements here, there and everywhere. Things like inuring aspects or coverages that trigger as long as, you know, only one part's covered and not the other, and so on. Any two of these five can go, but not the third. Yeah.
Well, and you get all these various like sublimits where it's, you know, within the motor, but if these claims of this category were then capped at this tiny amount, which just get ignored until you get into some looking at claims that have come through the door and you're reading through the contract to apply those. I
think codify unlimited things.
Right.
People do unlimited things sometimes.
It's
should we put 999,999 million?
When we were consulting, and anyone who's ever sort of tried to interrogate their company's data and has access to this kind of information will have certainly seen this, but there is hundreds of ways people have entered unlimited contracts in your system. Yeah. Right. And when we were doing consulting, you'd then begin to make these sort of like broad reaching, like anything that's above like 999 billion, we're going to count as an unlimited layer. Yeah. But there could be something, if it's in yen, it could be like $1 trillion top layer. Like there's scenarios by which that's not true, but because there's no like, this is the unlimited layer.
And it's the worst when you start to aggregate it, right? Because you wouldn't, that's the end. That's right at the end after a long time trying to work out why the sum of all layers across all of these different deals is so big, right?
How much limit did you place? Infinity.
Right? Like pretty much.
Yeah.
And then you're like,
So
one of these seems wrong. That's not a very
exclude
useful
these.
statistic.
Yeah. Well, and so it's this process by which we're trying to all get the computers to agree what's in them, and you're rekeying it so many times in all these parties, and therein lies we talked before about trying to get the sort of heads of the families on the same page to talk about deals, but it's so hard to align the conversation where you're working from the same bigger agreement, and that's compounded further by the fact that every party looks at things maybe differently, where there's a contract value, the sort of premium income for a contract, but that might be set on with adjustments. The reinsurer might be looking at it from what they've received to date. The broker might be looking at what the target premium is. They might already have the adjustment in mind, might be accounting for the uplift given what the premium development they've seen over the first sort of 6 months of the renewal might look like. All these things make it really, really hard that every party agrees they're on the same deals, but they have an impossible time trying to talk the same language about those deals.
And a real challenge trying to align the front and the back office as well, I think. And this is actually not a people problem, I think, at its root. I think the root cause is actually a technological lag, in the sense that the cedents, the brokers, the reinsurers, they're all willing and able to try and codify what they're doing live during a deal. Obviously it's not ideal to be spending too much time doing that whilst you're trying to get deals done, but they do maintain trackers in Excel so that they have a live view whilst they're doing deals. However, they're not that's not the way in which deals tend to be added to a system of record in a formal sense. And so instead what happens is the official route happens once the contract is fully bound, and it tends to be done by people who are not as close to the deal as those other people.
Yeah.
So then you end up with, often teams that have, been trained really well and, have an impressive command of what's in a reinsurance contract and how it's supposed to work. But they didn't do that deal at the end of the day. They weren't party to it. Yeah. And so they're trying to sort of get their head around what was attempted to be communicated between these parties and to try and codify it some way. And then often it becomes then a rework for the actual deal teams, because they have to review what a disconnected party has done 3 months after the deal has been concluded, and say, has such and such from our offshore team coded this into the system correctly? And you're like, not quite. Okay, I better give them a call and go back. And then you spend ages and ages of your sort of core team's time going back and forth with this other team who've tried to put the data in and haven't managed to put it in right.
Well, and when you think about it from a small company writing a handful of deals, it's super easy to have that conversation around what's the intention of this contract, how would it perform in these various scenarios, which can help that team entering it into the back office systems do that with a higher degree of accuracy. But oftentimes the larger these firms get, it's thousands and thousands of deals coming through during a busy season. They're just trying to get it all in. And you're right, there's a disconnect. I also think, to the point you made earlier, I think in many ways it's a failing of, it's driven by the creativity of our industry, where the ability for the brokers and even the reinsurers to create a new approach and price and get an idea of what that approach should be far out exceeds the speed by which the sort of software that they're running their back office on can adapt to it. So these new towers, new programs come through, and they're like,
this thing,
we should make it work this way.
Do I explain a top and drop? Or
how do I exactly
this clash thing? Or
and I don't know if that will ever be solved to many degrees. I think there's always going to be a desire and an ability for the brokers and the reinsurers to create problem-solving structures for their clients, and they shouldn't be beholden to the system only lets me do this, right? I think their creativity is more valuable than that.
And I think the root of many of the issues is not actually the limitation in terms of what systems can do, but more that everybody's got their own system that's doing it in a different way. I think, ironically, a lot of the promise that couldn't be delivered by blockchain was so appealing because it claimed that, once we figured out how the tech actually works, which never quite happened, blockchain was going to give this like shared record that everybody would each have a copy of.
Yep.
And that was pretty much the definition of what people didn't have. Is instead everybody had their own completely different and unrelated record that couldn't be reconciled.
Yeah.
Or if there was an official one, or somebody did have a system, it would be like one of the big brokers' proprietary systems that had one record of, but the client couldn't get access to that.
Yeah.
The reinsured couldn't get access to that, so they'd made their own way of recording that information with different fields and different ways of codifying the structure, etc.
Well, and this is where I think when our industry, the sort of futurists in our industry and those sort of ambitious people who look towards what it could look like kind of get out over their skis a little bit, where it's like, oh, it's going to be, I heard an analogy at a TinTech conference a couple of years back, but it was like the Minority Report, like glass walls and no files, and we're just moving things. I was like, whilst that's inherently interesting, it'd be cool to have that as the world we all live in.
Whilst we all want to be Tom Cruise.
Yeah, exactly. There was...
Except taller.
Those... Get off the couch, Tom.
He's a big listener, you might have just put him on.
Yeah. We're going to get sued by Tom Cruise, aren't we?
Possibly.
Another time.
Again. Yeah.
For the record, we've not been sued yet by Tom Cruise. But you have this, like, whilst I think we get excited by this ambition, like, wouldn't it be amazing if every time a car crash happened, the second they file their first notice of loss to their insurer, the reinsurer's quota share gets triggered and like
a red light starts flashing at the reinsurer's office,
and the bat symbol spins. But as much as that would be obviously exciting for that to be the world that we would live in, we have to sort of chip away at what do we need to do first before we get there. It's and I think those things are certainly possible, but they will be things that occur decades from now after we chip away at all these other little things along the journey. And I think it's very exciting to talk about what it could do, but that's not practical if we're starting to like, what are we going to do next year?
And it's really interesting. So just thinking about the question, how do we solve this? How do we tackle it? Is technology going to help us, and so on? And I actually think it's very different between the sort of deals side of things and the like submission packs side of things. Like the deals piece is really not actually about automation as such. It's much more about avoiding loads of work completely by getting a good record and then more integration APIs to share that information to avoid having to do any rekeying, right?
Yep.
So how do you get a shared record in real time of the deal and make it very easily accessible to other systems that also need that information?
Yeah. Well, that's the biggest issue, right? If you have one number that 10,000 people rekey, somewhere it's wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And this is what our industry has. You have this compounded that. But if you can say that's the record and the system sends it to all the other systems and the computers don't make the mistakes, you're eliminating a huge amount of error in the aggregate across the industry. And I think that will just, whilst it might benefit any individual firm, like I think there's benefit to the industry as a whole in this sort of aggregated efficiency and improvement that everyone benefits from.
Absolutely. And then you can start doing very exciting things with that data once it's played through. But then turning, I guess, back to pre-placement and this sort of how do you get all the data cuts ready and the packs ready? Now that is ripe pickings for automation, because that's manual, repetitive work that does have to be done. You do have to get the data ready. You do have to clean it up. Unless, there is a scenario where the actual insurance company is at a point where the same thing is happening with their deals in that their clients and their brokers and they themselves have a shared record of every deal. But I think it's so much harder in the much larger and more varied space that is the sort of general insurance market that makes up their portfolios. That's going to always be tough, for the foreseeable future.
Because in a similar way, like those insurers are incentivized to be super creative around what problems they solve. Like it's easy for us, and we have a sophisticated listener base, but when we explain to lay people about how our industry works.
Non-listeners.
Non-listeners, exactly. And share this podcast with your friends.
Yeah.
But we always lean into like a portfolio of home insurance or a portfolio of car insurance, because everyone has or has lived in a home, and everyone has seen a car. Let's just.
I was raised in a shoe.
By an old lady.
Exactly.
But in reality, you look at these companies and they're building net new cyber programs. They're building business owner policies and programs that include all manner of things for dentists and law firms. And they're sitting there looking at a universe of companies and businesses and individuals that all need insurance for a variety of ways. And they're not working from a list of, a menu that they can choose from. So they are incentivized, as they should be, to create products for the universe of insurance needs. But you're exactly right. Because it's not coming from the list of things they can choose from, they create their own products. They then put those into their own systems, which are built for the products they're creating. But then when it has to kind of get clumped upstream, it begins to look very differently. How have this policy is like one policy, but it has all these subcomponents to it. So how should that be broken out or similar? Really well-established classes, motor, homeowners, this kind of stuff, you can break out the casualty pieces and the property exposure pieces from that much more easily. But in a number of these policies, it was never intended to be broken out in that same way.
Yeah. And now more than ever, reinsurers are writing an open letter to their cedents saying, you must explain to us what's inside these portfolios, because we've been getting hit by secondary perils.
Yeah.
We want to get payback a bit more for some of the huge events and underpayment we've had over the last 2 decades of sustained soft cycles.
Yeah.
So unless you can really evidence to us everything that's going on in, as you said, these dentists portfolios, these D&O portfolios, cyber, and all sorts of policies beyond the vanilla homeowner stuff, then frankly the reinsurers probably aren't going to be interested.
Yeah. Well, and the ability for, and I think, again, where software can help, but where you could apply sort of massive assumptions to a book and say, in this book, because it comprises these things, apply 60% of the premium or the exposure sits in this class or category, and 30% sits here and 10% sits here. And therefore, this is what our exposure looks like to you, reinsurers, and be able to do that very easily, even though the underlying data just has it as sort of one category or similar. So software can make a lot of those things easier, more impactful, but it's certainly something that becomes the core of the challenges that the reinsurers face when assessing a new risk.
Absolutely. And now Cordy's abandoned us this week, which is heartbreaking. Wherever you are, Cordy, come back soon. But he did ask, on behalf of our listeners, whether we could help explain, through the power of analogy, what automation could mean. What is automation like in this placement-y data preparation type process? Because I think it can be very confusing. You hear things like automation, AI, algorithms, blockchain, IoT, like every buzzword imaginable, and you're like, hang on, which one's which, and what do they all do now, and what's the one I want? Right. Yeah. So we were having a bit of a laugh about this before the show as we were hurriedly trying to come up with some funny analogies. Have you managed to think of it?
I'm going to let you go first, then I'm going to see if it...
Okay. Well, I've gone for...
So you get the default victory for having one to hand.
But there's no judge here to...
Oh, yeah,
Jordan's not even here to tell us who's won. Oh, well.
The injustice of it all.
Yeah. But the first thing that came to my head when I thought, what is automation really, was actually Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Chapter 17. No, I'm kidding. I was impressed I even remembered which Harry Potter it was, to be honest. But I hope I've got it right now that I started talking about it. There's Hermione gets this, or Hermione as I used to call her, as I'm sure many of us did. She has this device that enables her to stop time. And this is a blended analogy, so wait for it.
Yep.
So on one hand, it's like Hermione's got this device that allows her to stop. I don't know if she actually stops time or if she goes back in time.
I think they go back in time.
Something Turner it's called. Anyway.
Yeah, and they can...
God.
Yeah, they go back in time because then they...
She goes back in time several times and all sorts of
And
things.
they can see themselves, but they said not to interact with them.
Classic time travel drama. But anyway, we digress. So let's pretend that this analogy worked vaguely in the sense that actually she was kind of just stopping time.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's pretend that she didn't have attitudes against the employment of house elves for work.
Mm-hmm.
It's like she then has like a giant army of house elves to do all of the manual work for her,
Mm-hmm.
but without any time passing by. So my Harry Potter-esque description of automation is like, you have giant pile of work to do and not all that much time to spend doing it, and no energy that you'd actually want to use your own energy to try and do it with. So here's the solution. We've got a thing called automation that means basically you can stop time, and then whilst time is stopped, a giant army of house elves are going to do all of that manual work for you, so that when you play time again, it's all been done and you don't have to worry about it. And that's kind of what automation feels like.
I like it. It's creative. I like this idea that computers don't actually work, and it's just hundreds of people behind the scenes doing everything.
Whilst time has been stopped.
Yeah. As you type letters, someone's like drawing on a stencil somewhere that they present to your computer.
But it's funny, I know we're sort of running slightly over time for this episode, but I think it's very easy to see, and if you take some of the stuff that Supercede automates, it's very easy to imagine yourself doing it manually as well.
Yeah.
Like if you've been there and you've done that, if it's, searching for stacking policies, for example, and you've done this before, I'm sure, that like having to scroll through, sort everything A to Z and just scroll through 1,000 rows and be like, are there any duplicates here, anything that's a primary in excess that I don't want to double count for, and so on. And when you press a button, it just does it for you and go, here are all the stacking ones. You're like, wow, he scrolls quick. It's like, no, they didn't scroll. The computer doesn't have to scroll.
I think the other important thing with that, and I think the analogy highlights nicely, is it's things you don't want to do, right? No one's going, oh, I wish I could automate watching this movie. It's like, well, just don't watch the movie then. If there's a thing you enjoy doing, you want to do, there's a relationship you have or a dinner you have or whatever it might be, that's valuable. It's just what feels tedious. And can we make the tedious things go away? And that's the pursuit of what we're trying to achieve with automation.
Get house elves to do things for you instantly.
Next episode, Reinsurance in the World of Wizardry.
I think we've got to come up with a Supercede slogan now that's loosely Harry Potter based.
Do we?
Supercede, the firebolt of... I'm trying to remember which broom is the best.
The Nimbus 2000?
I was going to say Nimbus 2000, but I feel like the Firebolt then overtook it in one of the later books.
This is going to divide the audience. We have some who are deep in nostalgia and some who are just screaming at their podcast player.
Well, on that mystery.
Until next time. Thanks, everybody.